A man who had spent his entire life building a name for himself and running an empire. But after a tragic accident left him in a wheelchair, he discovered something far more unsettling than his physical limitations. He had built a fortune, but not a life. Invisible in a world that once revolved around him, he faced indifference and rejection in ways he never had before. Until an unexpected act of kindness from a struggling black waitress changed everything. She had nothing to give except her compassion. Her selflessness created an opportunity she never could have imagined, one that would change her life forever. Raymond Caldwell had once been a man who commanded boardrooms, a man whose presence alone could silence a room full of executives hanging on his every word. His empire had been built on precision, on discipline, on an unyielding belief that time was money and efficiency was everything. He had spent decades immersed in the ruthless world of business, overseeing acquisitions, mergers, and corporate takeovers that had cemented his name among the wealthiest men in the state. His life had been a whirlwind of meetings, business luncheons, and flights on private jets, a constant chase for the next big deal, the next expansion, the next success that would further solidify his legacy. And yet, for all his wealth and power, for all the respect he commanded, there had never been time for much else. That was before the accident. Raymond never saw it coming. One moment he was seated in the back of his luxury car reviewing market reports on his tablet, while his driver navigated the familiar route to his downtown office. The next there was the deafening screech of tires, the sickening crunch of metal against metal, and then nothing. When he woke up, the world had changed. He had changed. His legs, once strong and steady, were now useless beneath him. Doctors said the spinal injury was permanent. There would be no miraculous recovery, no rehabilitation that could restore what was lost. The man who had once commanded an empire could no longer even command his own body. At first, Raymond refused to accept it. He threw himself into work, convinced that he could still run his empire from the comfort of his estate. But something had shifted. The board, once loyal and unwavering, had begun making decisions without him. Investors grew nervous. The man they had once seen as an unstoppable force was now a frail old man in a wheelchair, no longer the titan of industry he once was. Within a year, the inevitable happened. He was pushed out of his own company, his shares bought out, his influence reduced to nothing more than a footnote in the corporate world he had helped build. And just like that, the life he had dedicated himself to was gone. At 70 years old, Raymond Caldwell found himself with nothing but time. Time to sit in his grand estate, surrounded by silence. Time to watch as the people he once considered colleagues, allies, even friends drifted away. Their calls growing less frequent until they stopped altogether. Time to reflect on the reality that despite all he had accomplished, there was no one left who truly cared for him beyond what he could offer them. The nurses who came in daily to assist him were efficient but detached, doing their jobs with the clinical precision he had once admired in his employees. His household staff remained polite, dutiful, but they were just that, staff. They followed orders, catered to his needs, but never once asked how he was. Never once spoke to him beyond what was necessary. For the first time in his life, Raymond realized that he had spent decades building wealth, but never a life. He had power but no purpose. One morning, as he stared out the window of his study, watching the world move on without him, he made a decision. He would go out. He would not be confined to his estate, trapped in this self-imposed isolation. He would venture into the city alone, without his staff, without his driver, without the carefully orchestrated routine that had defined his existence for so long. He would see for himself what the world looked like when he was no longer at its center. Dressing simply in a button-down shirt and a light jacket, he wheeled himself out of his estate's grand doors for the first time in months. The cool morning air was a stark contrast to the sterile, temperature-controlled environment he had grown accustomed to. It was refreshing, almost jarring, as he maneuvered his wheelchair down the smooth, stone-paved driveway, his hands gripping the wheels firmly. The streets beyond his gated estate were alive with movement, with people rushing to work, mothers guiding their children across crosswalks, shop owners setting up for the day. He had lived in this city for decades, had invested millions into its businesses. Yet for the first time, he felt like a stranger in his own home. He made his way toward a restaurant he used to frequent, a high-end establishment that had always reserved the best table for him. He wanted to see if they still recognized him, if they would still treat him the same way they had before the accident. As he approached the entrance, maneuvering his chair toward the grand double doors, his wheels suddenly caught on the uneven pavement just outside the doorway. He pushed forward, but the chair barely moved. He was stuck. A small line of patrons had begun to form behind him, their murmurs growing impatient. Some sighed audibly, checking their watches, shifting uncomfortably as they waited. And then the restaurant manager appeared. Raymond recognized him instantly, a man who had once bent over backward to ensure his every visit was flawless. But now there was no recognition in his eyes, no deference. Instead, there was only irritation. "Sir, you're blocking the entrance," the man said, his voice laced with impatience. Raymond opened his mouth to respond, to explain, but before he could, the manager stepped forward and gripped the handles of his wheelchair, forcibly pulling him back from the doorway. The motion was sudden, jarring, stripping him of whatever dignity he had left. "You need to move," the man continued, louder now, as if Raymond was some inconvenience, an obstacle to be removed. "We have customers waiting." For a long moment, Raymond sat there, frozen, humiliation washing over him in waves. Once he had been the man who walked through those doors without a second glance, greeted with smiles, his table always waiting, his presence always welcomed. But now he was just another nameless old man in a wheelchair. Without another word, he turned his chair away and left. Humiliated and hollow, Raymond wheeled himself away from the restaurant, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. He wasn't sure where he was going, only that he needed to leave to get as far from that place as possible. The murmurs of discontented patrons still echoed in his ears, the dismissive tone of the restaurant manager reverberating like a slap across his pride. The world had changed around him, or perhaps, he realized bitterly, it had always been this way. He had simply been too powerful to notice. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting long streaks of gold across the city, but Raymond felt none of its warmth. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but he had no desire to return to his estate, where breakfast would be prepared for him without question, where food would be placed in front of him like he was another piece of the furniture, accommodated but never acknowledged. He needed to eat somewhere that didn't feel sterile, where he could sit as an ordinary man. His gaze drifted across the street. That was when he saw it. A small, unassuming diner sat on the corner, its large windows slightly fogged up from the heat of the kitchen inside. The sign above the door was faded, its neon letters flickering uncertainly between Ruby's Diner and a dull humming glow. It was a place he had never noticed before, the kind of establishment he would have once driven past without a second thought. Unlike the upscale restaurant he had just been turned away from, this place looked well, worn, but lived in. The kind of place where people came not just to eat, but to exist. It was exactly what he needed. He turned his wheelchair toward the intersection, but as soon as he reached the curb, he was reminded of just how difficult something as simple as crossing the street had become. The pavement sloped unevenly, and each push of his wheels felt like a battle against gravity. His arms strained as he tried to maneuver himself forward, but the wheels resisted. A honk sounded in the distance, the city moving around him, and for the first time in his life, Raymond felt utterly small. Then a voice. "Need some help?" It was a young woman's voice, firm but warm, with a note of genuine concern. Raymond turned his head and found himself looking up into a pair of deep brown eyes, framed by tight curls that were pulled into a low ponytail. She was young, mid-20s maybe, her dark skin smooth and glowing in the morning light. She wasn't dressed like a corporate worker or someone in a rush. She wore a simple blue button-down and dark jeans, a name tag pinned neatly to her shirt. Maya, it read. Before he could refuse, she had already stepped to his side, her hands gently gripping the handles of his wheelchair. "It's tricky, huh? These sidewalks weren't made with wheelchairs in mind," she said, her tone easy, unbothered, as if helping a stranger was just part of her morning routine. Raymond felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite place. Pride, embarrassment, but he gave a small nod. "I was trying to get to that diner," he admitted. Maya grinned. "Well, you're in luck. That's where I work. Come on, I'll get you there. With surprising ease, she maneuvered the wheelchair off the curb, guiding him across the street with practiced confidence. Unlike the people at the restaurant, she didn't seem annoyed by his presence, didn't treat him like an inconvenience. There was no pity in her expression, no condescension, just kindness, offered without expectation. As they reached the front entrance of Ruby's diner, Maya pulled open the door and held it for him, letting him roll inside at his own pace. The interior of the diner was exactly as Raymond had imagined. Cozy, slightly worn, but warm. The scent of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the low hum of conversation and the occasional clatter of dishes from the kitchen. The people here weren't dressed in expensive suits, weren't impatiently checking their watch. They were truck drivers, construction workers, young parents with kids in tow, ordinary people living ordinary lives. Maya guided him toward a table near the window. "This okay?" she asked. Raymond nodded, and as he settled in, he realized with a start that this was the first time in years that he had been asked where he wanted to sit rather than being automatically placed at the most prestigious table. Maya handed him a menu, but before he could even open it, she smiled knowingly. "First time here, huh?" Raymond chuckled, a small, genuine laugh that surprised even himself. "That obvious?" "A little," she admitted playfully. "Well, let me make it easy for you. The best thing on the menu is the house special eggs, bacon, toast, and a side of home fries. Simple, but it'll hit the spot. And trust me, the coffee here is better than anywhere else in town." Raymond hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "That sounds good." Maya scribbled the order down, then glanced back at him. "Cream and sugar, black," Raymond replied. She gave him a thumbs up. "Nice choice. I'll be right back." As she disappeared toward the kitchen, Raymond let out a slow breath, glancing around the diner. There was no tension in the air, no whispers about him, no eyes watching him like he didn't belong. He was just another customer here, another person looking for a meal. It felt normal, and for the first time in a long time, normal felt like a gift. Raymond sat in quiet contemplation, his fingers absent-mindedly running along the edge of the laminated menu. The diner buzzed with the sounds of breakfast being served, of conversations blending into the comfortable hum of morning life, the clinking of coffee cups, the scrape of utensils against plates, the occasional burst of laughter. It was a symphony he hadn't realized he'd missed. The world inside Ruby's diner felt separate from the cold indifference he had experienced outside. A pocket of warmth in a city that had otherwise moved on without him. A few minutes later, Maya returned, balancing a steaming cup of black coffee in one hand and a small plate of toast in the other. She set them down with practiced ease, her movements smooth and effortless. "Here you go, fresh off the pot," she said, sliding the coffee toward him. "Food will be up in a few minutes, but I figured you might want something to sip on while you wait." Raymond nodded, surprised at how natural this interaction felt. He had been to countless restaurants, had been served by waiters who were trained to be polite, to cater to his every need. But there had always been an invisible barrier between them. Money, status, expectation. Here with Maya, there was none of that. She treated him like she would anyone else, and he found himself unexpectedly grateful for that. Lifting the cup to his lips, he took a slow sip, letting the rich bitterness settle on his tongue. She was right. The coffee was good, better than the overpriced brews he used to drink in executive lounges. He placed the cup down, his fingers curling around the ceramic, and allowed himself a moment to simply exist, without expectations, without obligation. Maya moved easily through the diner, refilling cups, taking orders, exchanging jokes with customers like she had known them forever. She radiated an effortless warmth, the kind of presence that made people feel comfortable, welcomed. Raymond watched as she greeted an older man at the counter with a playful elbow bump, then turned to ruffle the hair of a young boy sitting in a booth with his mother. She wasn't just serving food, she was part of this place, part of the fabric that held it together. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of something hitting the table. Looking down, he realized his hand had knocked his spoon off the saucer. He exhaled sharply, frustrated by the small betrayal of his fingers, by the weakness in his hands that made such simple tasks feel like challenges. He moved to reach for it, but before he could, Maya was there. "Don't worry about that," she said, scooping up the fallen spoon with an easy smile. She disappeared behind the counter for a moment, then returned with a clean one. "Happens all the time." Raymond hesitated, watching as she placed the new spoon next to his cup. Something about the way she did it without hesitation, without a second thought, made his throat tighten. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. Maya shrugged. "Sure, I did." Well, she tilted her head slightly, studying him as if the question itself surprised her. "Because people should help each other," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "That's just how it should be." He stared at her, trying to remember the last time someone had done something for him, without expecting anything in return. The realization settled into his chest like a weight. He couldn't. A voice called Maya's name from the kitchen, and she gave him a small nod before heading back toward the counter. He watched her go, the ease in her steps, the way she carried herself with a quiet confidence that made the space around her feel lighter. She didn't know who he was. She had no idea how much money he had, how much power he had once wielded, and yet she had treated him with more dignity in the last 20 minutes than some people had in the last 2 years. A short while later, she returned with his plate, setting it down in front of him with the same casual care she had shown before. "How special," she said, tapping the edge of the plate lightly. "Hope you like it." Raymond picked up his fork, the scent of buttered toast and crispy bacon filling the space between them. He took a bite, the warmth of the food settling into his stomach in a way that made him realize just how hungry he had been. It was simple, unpretentious, but somehow it was the best meal he had eaten in a long time. When he finished, he reached for his wallet, but Maya placed a hand on his forearm, stopping him before he could pull out any money. "It's on me," she said. Raymond blinked, genuinely taken aback. "You don't have to do that," she grinned. "Yeah, I do." "Well, because you looked like you needed someone too." The answer was so simple, so direct that he had no response. He wasn't used to kindness without conditions, without fine print. He wasn't used to someone looking at him and seeing a person rather than a problem, or worse, an inconvenience. For the first time in a long time, Raymond felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. He wasn't sure what it was, but it felt a lot like hope. Raymond sat there for a long moment, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, staring at the empty plate before him. The warmth of the meal still lingered in his stomach, but something else, something deeper, had settled inside him. A quiet sort of gratitude, unfamiliar, but undeniable. He had spent years in dining rooms where the wine flowed endlessly, where the dishes were served beneath silver domes, with waiters standing by in silence. But he couldn't remember the last time he had felt full in the way he did now. It wasn't just the food, it was the way Maya had looked at him, not with pity, not with impatience, but with genuine kindness, a simple, effortless act of decency given without expectation. Maya had already moved on, weaving between tables, laughing with customers, refilling cups of coffee, as if this moment, this morning, was just another part of her day. But for Raymond, it was more than that. It had been a long time since someone had made him feel seen. As he reached for his wallet again, determined to leave a tip at the very least, he felt a gentle but firm hand on the handle of his wheelchair. He turned his head and found Maya standing behind him, a teasing smirk playing on her lips. "Nice try," she said, shaking her head. "I told you this one's on me." Raymond exhaled a quiet chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "You won't let me win, will you?" "Not today," she said, stepping around him and holding the door open. "But if you really want to make it up to me, just come back sometime. That'd be enough." The way she said it casually without expectation made him pause. She wasn't being polite. She meant it. Raymond gave her a small nod and rolled himself toward the door, the morning air crisp against his skin as he moved onto the sidewalk. The world outside felt different than it had when he arrived. The weight he had carried into the diner, the bitterness from that first rejection at the restaurant hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted, made room for something else. As he wheeled himself down the street, the city moved around him as it always had, people in suits walking briskly, cars honking impatiently, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the occasional gust of wind carrying city dust. But this time he paid attention. He noticed the details. The older woman waiting at the bus stop, adjusting the strap on her purse. The teenager balancing a tray of iced coffees as she hurried across the street. The construction worker laughing with his coworker as they leaned against a steel beam. These were the people he had overlooked for years. The ones who had always been there while he had been too busy moving from one meeting to the next. Too busy to notice the world beyond his own ambitions. When he arrived back at his estate, the silence greeted him like an old companion, stretching out in long, empty halls, filling the spaces between carefully curated furniture and expensive art. The staff moved like shadows, efficient and unobtrusive, their voices hushed as they completed their duties. No one asked where he had been. No one seemed to notice he had left at all. He rolled into his study, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the smooth mahogany surface of his desk. The bookshelves lining the walls were filled with leather-bound volumes he had never had time to read. The fireplace sat cold, untouched. A decade ago, this room had been his war room, the place where deals were made, where fortunes were built. Now it felt like a museum exhibit, preserved but lifeless. His gaze drifted to the large window overlooking the city. From here he could see the skyline, the towering buildings, the streets that had once felt like they belonged to him. He had spent years building his legacy, ensuring that his name would be remembered. But for what? His company had moved on without him. The people he had worked alongside had barely looked back. And now here he was, a man with more wealth than he could ever spend. And yet, for all the power he had once wielded, he had never felt so powerless. And yet there was Maya. The thought of her brought a flicker of something unexpected. Curiosity. Not just about her, but about the way she lived, the way she carried herself, the way she had spoken about helping others, like it was as natural as breathing. She hadn't asked him who he was. She hadn't cared. And for the first time in a long time, that had felt like a relief. He leaned back in his chair, his mind turning over a thought, an idea that slowly began to take shape. Maya had helped him without hesitation, without expectation. Perhaps it was time he did the same. The thought lingered in Raymond's mind long after he had returned home. He had spent years making decisions that affected thousands of people, approving million-dollar deals with the flick of a pen. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the simplest gesture, a meal given without expectation, had left a deeper impact than any of those business transactions. And then there was Maya. He had seen kindness before, but hers was different. It wasn't the performative generosity he had encountered in corporate circles, where charity was just another tax-deductible expense. It wasn't driven by social expectation or ulterior motives. It was something else entirely, effortless, instinctive, real. That night, Raymond couldn't sleep. Instead, he found himself thinking about the way Maya had smiled at every customer who walked through the diner doors. How she had moved through the space like she belonged there, like it was more than just a job to her. He thought about how she had paid for his meal without hesitation, even though she clearly didn't have much to spare. He hadn't realized it in the moment, but there had been something in her eyes. Tiredness, perhaps, or maybe the weight of responsibilities she didn't speak about. The next morning, Raymond called for his assistant, a man named Thomas, who had worked for him for nearly 15 years. "I need you to take me somewhere," Raymond said as Thomas entered the study, standing with his usual composed professional demeanor. "Of course, sir. Where would you like to go?" Raymond hesitated for only a moment before saying, "Ruby's Diner." Thomas's expression barely flickered. He was trained never to question orders, but the request was unusual enough that Raymond saw a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. He didn't explain. He simply allowed Thomas to push his wheelchair through the grand entrance of the estate out to the waiting town car. Within moments, they were on the road, moving through the city Raymond had once ruled, but now barely recognized. When they arrived at the diner, Raymond insisted on waiting outside, watching for a moment before going in. That was when he saw it. Maya was already working, though it was clear from the weary slump of her shoulders that she hadn't had much rest. The early morning rush had begun, and she was moving between tables, balancing plates and refilling coffee cups with the same energy and warmth she had shown him the day before, but now standing outside, watching without being noticed. Raymond saw the things he had missed before. Her uniform was neat, but slightly faded. The fabric worn in places from repeated use. Her shoes, practical and sturdy, had seen better days. And yet none of that seemed to bother her. She greeted every customer with a smile, made each one feel like they mattered, as if serving them wasn't just her job, but something she genuinely took pride in. Then he saw something else, something that made his chest tighten. Between tables, in those brief moments when she thought no one was looking, Maya's smile faltered. It wasn't dramatic, just a flicker, a passing shadow across her face before she pulled herself together. But Raymond recognized it. It was the kind of exhaustion that ran deeper than just being tired. It was the kind that came from caring too much for too long. Raymond had spent his life reading people, understanding what motivated them, what pressures they faced. He could tell just by looking at her that Maya was struggling, and yet despite that, she still found a way to be kind. He had seen enough. "Let's go in," Raymond said quietly. Thomas wheeled him through the entrance, and as soon as they crossed the threshold, Mia's face lit up. "Well, look who's back," she said with a grin, balancing a tray in one hand as she approached. "Couldn't resist the coffee, huh?" Raymond smirked. "It's growing on me." Maya set the tray down at a nearby table before turning her attention back to him. "You want your usual?" He chuckled. "I didn't realize I had a usual already." She shrugged playfully. "Happens fast around here." Raymond hesitated, then glanced toward Thomas. "Actually, I was hoping to talk to you when you have a minute." Something in his tone must have told her it was serious, because the teasing light in her eyes dimmed just a little. She nodded, wiped her hands on her apron, and gestured toward an empty booth. "Give me 2 minutes. Let me just drop off this order." When she returned, she slid into the seat across from him, resting her elbows on the table. "All right, Mr. Caldwell, what's on your mind?" Raymond studied her for a moment before speaking. "I want to know about you, Maya." She raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you did something for me yesterday that you didn't have to do," he said. "And I can tell that wasn't a one-time thing. You help people not because you have to, but because that's who you are." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But I also get the feeling that you're caring more than you let on." Maya's expression didn't change immediately, but he saw the subtle shift, the slight tension in her jaw, the way she inhaled just a little deeper than usual before responding. "I don't know about all that," she said with a small shrug. "I mean, yeah, things aren't easy, but that's life, right? Everybody's got something." Raymond didn't look away. "Tell me," she hesitated, then let out a slow breath. "My mom's sick," she admitted. "Has been for a while. She's in a nursing facility a few miles from here. I try to visit as much as I can, but between shifts and covering bills, it's tough." Raymond listened, not interrupting. "She used to work 3 jobs just to keep us afloat," Maya continued. "Never complained, never let me feel like we were struggling, even when we were. And now it's my turn to take care of her." She smiled faintly, but there was something wistful in it. "She always told me that no matter how hard things get, you don't stop being a good person. You don't stop showing up for people." Raymond leaned back in his chair, absorbing her words. He had spent his life surrounded by people who only did things when there was something in it for them. Yet here was Maya, someone who had every reason to be bitter, to be selfish, and instead she had chosen kindness. He made his decision then and there. "I want to help," he said simply. Maya blinked. "Help?" "Yes." His voice was steady, unwavering. "Your mother's medical bills, your debt, everything that's keeping you from living the life you deserve. I want to take care of it." For the first time since meeting her, Maya looked truly caught off guard. She stared at him, searching his face as if trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke. "Why?" Raymond gave her the smallest of smiles. "Because people should help each other," he said, echoing her own words back to her. Maya let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "You don't even know me." Raymond met her gaze. "I know enough." She was silent for a long moment, then exhaled, shaking her head. "Mr. Caldwell, I can't take that kind of money from you." "Yes, you can," he countered. "And you will?" Maya let out another small laugh, but this time there was something else in it, something softer, something uncertain. "You're serious?" "I am." She looked down at the table, exhaling sharply. When she looked up again, her eyes were glistening slightly, but her smile remained. I don't even know what to say. Say yes, Raymond said simply. And for the first time in a long, long time, Maya let someone help her. Maya sat in the stunned silence, her hands resting flat against the table as if grounding herself in reality. Raymond had just offered her something she had never imagined possible. A lifeline, a way out of the endless cycle of worry and exhaustion that had shaped her life for as long as she could remember. Her mother's hospital bills, the mounting debt that kept her up at night, the feeling that no matter how hard she worked, she was always one step behind. It could all disappear with a single word. She opened her mouth, then closed it, shaking her head slightly, as if trying to clear her thoughts. This is crazy, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. You barely know me. I mean, you don't owe me anything. Raymond exhaled slowly, resting his hands on the arms of his wheelchair. His gaze remained steady, unwavering. That's the thing, Maya, he said. The best acts of kindness aren't about owing anyone anything. You helped me when you didn't have to. Not because of who I am, not because you expected something in return, but because that's just the kind of person you are. He paused, letting his words settle. So let me do the same for you. Maya swallowed, her throat suddenly tight. I don't even know what to say. Then don't say anything, Raymond said simply. Just let me help. She looked down at her hands, fingers curling slightly against the worn surface of the table. The logical part of her wanted to push back, to insist that she could handle things on her own, that she had spent years standing on her own 2 feet and wasn't about to change that now. But another part, the exhausted, quietly desperate part, whispered something different. What if you let someone help you? Just this once. She looked back up at Raymond, studying him in a way she hadn't before. He wasn't just offering money. He was offering her a chance, a way to breathe, a way to step out from under the weight she had carried for so long. Slowly, cautiously, she nodded. Okay. Raymond smiled, the kind of smile that felt like the end of a long storm. Good. The next few weeks passed in a blur. True to his word, Raymond moved quickly. Within days, Maya's mother's medical bills had been paid in full. The debts that had hung over her like a storm cloud were gone, wiped away with a few signed documents and phone calls from people who owed Raymond more favors than they cared to admit. But he didn't stop there. One afternoon, Maya received a call from Thomas, Raymond's assistant. Can you meet us downtown, he asked. There's something Mr. Caldwell wants to show you. Maya hesitated. She had just finished a long shift at the diner, her feet aching, exhaustion pressing at the edges of her thoughts. But something in Thomas's tone told her this wasn't something to brush off. So she grabbed her coat, caught the next bus, and made her way to the address he provided. When she arrived, she found herself standing in front of a small storefront on a quiet street, the kind of place she had passed by 100 times without thinking twice. The windows were covered with brown paper, but a sign had been freshly taped to the glass. Coming soon, Maya's kitchen. Maya's breath caught. She turned slowly, her heart pounding as she saw Raymond sitting in his wheelchair just a few feet away, watching her with that same knowing smile. This. Her voice trailed off as she looked back at the sign, then at the building itself. This is mine. Raymond nodded. I told you I wanted to help. Maya shook her head, stepping closer, pressing a palm against the cool glass, as if she needed to feel it to believe it. I don't understand. I do, Raymond said. I've spent most of my life throwing money at things that didn't matter. Buildings, investments, companies that traded hands 100 times over. None of it ever meant anything but this. He gestured toward the storefront. This is something real, something that belongs to someone who actually deserves it. Maya turned back to him, her eyes bright with emotion. I don't even know how to run a restaurant. Raymond smirked. I didn't know how to run a billion-dollar company when I started either. You'll figure it out. She let out a laugh, short, breathless, a little overwhelmed. But there was something steady beneath it. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving. She was standing at the beginning of something new. As she turned back toward the building, taking it in, she felt something shift inside her. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just looking at a dream. She was living it. Months later, the doors to Maya's kitchen opened for the first time. The space was small but warm, filled with the smell of fresh bread and simmering spices. The kind of place that felt like home even to those who had never set foot inside before. The tables were filled almost immediately. Locals, travelers, people who had once been strangers but quickly became regulars. And in the center of it all was Maya, moving through the space with ease, greeting customers by name, laughing as she took orders, making sure every person who walked through the door felt like they belonged. Near the window at his usual table, Raymond sat with a cup of coffee in hand, watching the world he had helped create. He had spent his life believing that power was in wealth, in influence, in control. But in the end, it wasn't money that had changed anything. It was kindness, the kind that expected nothing in return, the kind that sometimes changed everything. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.